So she happened to stop by Boaz's field, who was a mighty man of wealth, and he's a rich man, and he happens to have an interesting inheritance, or an interesting history. He is the son to Rahab, who was the harlot that was in Jericho when the children of Israel came. And what an amazing coincidence this is. And so here's an individual that, of course, would understand. I don't think he would have a lot of the prejudices that many individuals would have. He would understand that anyone could come to Christ, and that God saves all kinds of people, and God uses all kinds of people. And here he has come from his mother being a harlot to having being a man of much esteem and a mighty man of wealth. And the last time we looked at this, Naomi has revealed to Ruth that this man Boaz is her next of kin. And so she suggests to Ruth that you go and tell him that he's next of kin, and you ask him to perform the duty of a kinsman redeemer by you. And here Boaz finds out, and he's thrilled to death about it. And he says, "Blessed be you of the Lord." He said, "You could have gone and tried to marry one of the..." Obviously, this young lady Ruth was much sought after. Boaz was impressed that she didn't just go out and look for an easy marriage, but that he felt privileged that she'd come to him and ask him to fulfill the obligations of the marriage. What's neat about that, my friend? Is it neat because it's a beautiful romantic story? That's neat, but you know what's really neat about it? Is that God's way's better. God's way's better. And see, Ruth could have done it man's way, and man's way would have been, I'm an attractive young lady, and the men in the fields have taken notice of me, and I can have a handsome young man for a spouse, or I can go after a rich young man. But, that guy's older, and so what? If God's law says I have to marry him, he's not my type. You know what Ruth said? She says, God's way's my way. And she set her path to behave that way from the time that she married one of the sons, sickly or pining, whichever one it was that she married. Can I say to you tonight, folks, God will never do a great thing in your life until you become faithful. Ruth has made up her mind that she is going to make God number one in her life. And then God begins to work. Too many of us have an attitude that says, well, God, I'll be faithful if you prove to me that you're good. My friend, God proved that He was good in the person of Jesus Christ. God doesn't owe us anything, and He's not obligated of anything to us. And many of us have this mindset, or we have this attitude toward holy God, that He's got to win us or prove to us that He is worthy to be served. My friend, God is God, and it's a privilege to be in His service. And if you think that God is going to bless an attitude that says, well, God, give me a little something and then I'll do something for you, what kind of a God would He be? And let me ask you a question. How likely would we be to fulfill our promise? A lot of people say, God, if you'll only, then I will. How many of us have made these promises to God? God, if you'll get me out of this situation, then I'll go to church the rest of my life. I've met those people, and they don't go to church very much, for the most part. God, if you'll get me out of this situation, I'll never do this again. I've met those people, and they usually go right back into the filth they were in before God delivered them. And all kind of times we say, God, if you will, then I will. And friend, I want to say to you, God knows your heart. And He knows if you mean that or not. And He's not going to play silly games. And so you can't say, well, God, you didn't. I said I'd do this, and you didn't do what I said that you had to do if I were going to do that. And so you're not good. My friend, God knows you. He knows you're a liar. He does. Let's just be honest about it. He knows the future. He knows all about us. He knows us better than we know ourselves. And we can believe ourselves, but He knows we're lying. And He's a holy God, and He's a wise God. Well, let's get in our text tonight. I just want to look at a couple of things. We're going to see how it all comes out. And I want to submit to you this evening that it may be that you're in a place or a time in your life when you feel as though you are desolate. When you feel as though you went out full and now you are empty-handed. Can I say to you that God's still good, and you can come to understand that? Boy, Naomi's had a remarkable change in attitude, hasn't she? By the way, isn't it encouraging that maybe she didn't have the right spirit like her daughter-in-law had, but that God still won her, and that He still showed her His goodness? Aren't you glad God doesn't just scrap you when you're not everything you ought to be? But I want to say something. I'd far rather be Ruth than Naomi, wouldn't you? And so here we are in chapter 2. Naomi had a kinsman of her husband's, a mighty man of wealth, of the family of Elimelech. I'm reading the wrong scripture. That's why it doesn't make sense. Chapter 4 and verse 1. Then Boaz went up to the gate and sat him down there. And behold, the kinsman of whom Boaz spake came by, unto whom he said, Ho, such a one, turn aside, sit down here. I think that's a good greeting, by the way. Okay, so here's Boaz, and he goes up to the gate where the elders of the city, the men that are well respected, would sit. And obviously this gives you an idea of the kind of a person that Boaz himself was. You wouldn't go and sit with the elders in the gate. This would be a place, almost like a marketplace, but be a very public entering in place. And the individual sitting there would be counted worthy to, if you will, stand even in place of judgment. And these elders of the city were leaders in the city and widely respected men. And Boaz goes up and takes his place among them, which gives you the impression that Boaz is himself one of the elders of the city, or one of the men that is held in great esteem. And so he's there, and he knows that this kinsman of his, whose family as well, who has a closer connection to Naomi and has a greater obligation to marry Ruth than he himself has, is going to pass through. So here comes Boaz, and he sits in the gate of the city, and here comes by this next kinsman, near kinsman, who is concerned about losing what he has. And Boaz says, Ho, such a one, turn aside, sit down here. I think it's a good greeting, by the way. If you see a brother or sister in Christ, ho, such a one. Anyway, I think it's great language. And I've actually used it before, and I think I'll adopt those phrases again. Ho, such a one, turn aside, sit down here. And so here comes this fella, and well, it's Boaz speaking, and so he better sit down. And so he does. And you wonder what goes through the mind of this individual as he's called to sit down here. See, everybody in Bethlehem, Judah knows about Ruth, right? Yes, they do. Why? Because Boaz knew about her when he found out who she was. Remember when he inquired about her in her fields? And she came and she told him who she was, and he said, I've heard about you and all the things that you've done for Naomi. And he knew he was related to her. He wouldn't have ever considered marriage because of his age, and he just wouldn't have thought that she'd have wanted to be a part of that, and it would have, from his perspective, given him the privilege of marrying her. But so now here's a kinsman who's passing by, and if Boaz and everyone else knew who Ruth was, I expect that this kinsman did. And I expect that when he is stopped and told to come over and that he's got business there, he probably knew a little bit about it, but the text seems to indicate that he doesn't know that he's obligated to marry Ruth. He just seems to think that he can get the land. And so here's what Boaz says. He took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, Sit ye down here, and they sat down. So Boaz says, Okay, you 10 men, you sit here. And then he says unto the kinsman, Naomi, that has come again out of the country of Moab, selleth a parcel of land, which was our brother Elimelech's. He said, Hey, Naomi has got a piece of land for sale, which was our brother Elimelech's. In other words, they're either directly brothers or brethren. They're very closely related. Naomi's back, and she's going to sell Elimelech's land. And boy, this kinsman perks right up. And he thinks, man, I could get more land. And I could be in a stronger position financially because of this thing. And I thought to advertise these, saying, Buy it before the inhabitants and before the elders of the people. And so here's Boaz leading him along, if you will. And it's very clever how he does it. He says, my thought is, you're family, and so you ought to have first go at it. You ought to be the one that redeems it first. He didn't say the word redeem it. You ought to be the one that's allowed to buy it first. And he says, if thou wilt redeem it, but if thou wilt not redeem it, then tell me that I may know. So he says, now here's the deal. I think that you're closest to Naomi, and so you ought to have the first right at it. But if you're not going to take it, I'll buy it. And this guy's like, I'll take it. So he says, for there's none to redeem it besides thee, and I'm after thee. And he said, I'll redeem it. Oh, here's a pretty interesting situation. If you could imagine the tension and what's going on here. Naomi's selling her land. Well, I'll buy it. You think he knew about Ruth? I think he did. Do you know what's different between this man and Boaz? Boaz cares about God's law. This man understands